The transport shuttle descended through the violet atmosphere of Velnor 6 with a low metallic hum, its hull shuddering from the sudden clash with the freezing winds that circled the planet like a permanent storm. Inside, rows of cadets sat strapped to their seats, each wrapped in thermal membranes that shimmered faintly under the dim cabin lights. These membranes were grown, not manufactured, and had been perfected by several alien species over countless generations. Every cadet who wore one trusted it more than any equipment issued by the Academy. In the middle of this group sat the only human, Elias Ward, dressed in the same standard uniform every cadet received, but without anything that might give him an advantage over the others. His jacket was thick, but entirely inadequate against the temperatures he was about to face. The others looked at him occasionally, some with curiosity, some with quiet pity, and a few with a mild sense of dread, as if watching someone walk willingly into a fate already sealed. The instructor, a tall, crystalline alien whose body refracted light in sharp angles, moved down the aisle once the shuttle stabilized in its descent. She spoke with a clipped tone that always carried finality, as if her words were immutable law. She informed the cadets that the night on Velnor 6 was approaching, and the midnight freeze trial would begin the moment they were dropped at the surface. She reminded them that frost storms rolled across the plains without warning, and temperatures could plummet to lethal levels in less than an hour. She glanced at Elias for a fraction of a second, not with malice, but with the subtle resignation of someone who believed she already knew the outcome of the story. She emphasized, with a tone sharpened by rehearsed neutrality, that no human had ever lasted a single night on this world without external technology. The Academy forbade technology this time, insisting that this test measure raw resilience and adaptability. She did not say that this rule had been introduced only after humans gained a reputation for outlasting biological species through engineering. She did not need to. Every cadet understood it. The shuttle landed with a crunch as its skids met solid ice. The door slid open, and a wave of brutal cold flowed inside, spilling over the metal floor like liquid frost. The alien cadets recoiled instinctively, pressing their membranes closer around their bodies. Elias inhaled sharply as the cold hit him, piercing his lungs like thin needles. He stepped forward anyway. His boots sank slightly into the snow, which was more crystalline than powdery, forming small, sharp fragments that fractured under each step. He studied the environment while the others adjusted their membranes. The landscape stretched endlessly in muted tones of blue and silver. The plain was flat, with occasional broken ridges of ice rising from the ground like jagged bones. The sun hung low, a pale sphere smothered by swirling frost clouds drifting across the horizon. It was beautiful in a distant, indifferent way. A group of alien cadets clustered to one side, exchanging quiet remarks about Elias. One whispered that he should not have volunteered for this trial. Another muttered that he lacked any natural adaptation for this climate, unlike the rest of them. A third cadet, whose species thrived in humid jungles, asked if the Academy intended to collect a body by morning. The remarks were not cruel. They were stated with the heavy logic of biological expectations. Elias heard the words, and although none were wrong from a biological standpoint, he refused to let them take root. He focused on the landscape instead, analyzing the wind direction, noting how the gusts carried fine sheets of snow sideways rather than downward. The wind was the real killer here, not the cold alone. He needed to understand it before darkness arrived. The instructor spoke again, her voice amplified by a communicator embedded in her crystalline chest. She outlined the rules. Survive until sunrise without tools, shelters, or thermal devices. Remain within the designated boundary, and no cadet could interfere with another's survival attempt. She paused after each rule, letting the weight of the trial settle over the group. Finally, she gave the command, and the shuttle lifted off, leaving a cloud of frost swirling in its wake. The moment the shuttle rose into the sky, every cadet felt the sudden isolation of the planet, as if the world itself exhaled a cold breath meant only for them. Elias stood alone after the others dispersed toward the nearest ice cliffs, seeking caves and crevices where the winds might be weaker. He watched them move with hurried confidence, each trusting personal instincts. He had no such instincts for this world. He had only observation, improvisation, and the quiet understanding that no one else would save him. He crouched and touched the ground, feeling the texture of the ice beneath the thin layer of snow. The cold burned through his glove almost immediately, forcing him to pull his hand back. He noticed that the snow drifted more heavily near the base of tall frozen formations, gathering in patterns shaped by the wind. He traced the pattern with his eyes, identifying the dominant direction of airflow. If he could break that wind, if he could interrupt the gusts even slightly, he might slow the heat loss from his body long enough to make it through the night. As the sun continued its slow descent, the temperature dropped perceptibly. His breath thickened in the air, forming small clouds that condensed into frost along his collar. He flexed his fingers, feeling them stiffen. Yet he remained calm, not with blind optimism, but with a deliberate refusal to panic. He understood that panic was wasted energy, and waste was death in a place like this. He scanned the plane again, searching for anything he could use, not as technology, but as environment. He spotted fallen crystal tree branches half buried in snow. The branches were brittle, their insides hollowed by centuries of exposure, yet still capable of blocking wind. He also noticed uneven ridges that could serve as natural anchors. The world was inhospitable, but it was not devoid of resources. Far in the distance, one alien cadet already retreated into a cave, his membrane wrapped tightly around him. Another struggled to seal his membrane vents as the wind howled louder. Elias remained out in the open, studying the wind as if it were a puzzle that could be solved. The planet was not trying to kill him, he thought. The planet was simply what it was. If he understood it correctly, he would survive. If he misunderstood it, he would die. The clarity of that thought steadied him. The sun touched the horizon, staining the sky with deeper shades of blue. The first true bite of night pressed against the world, and every cadet felt the shift. Elias pulled his jacket closer and began walking toward the crystal tree debris with firm, deliberate steps. He knew the others believed he would freeze by midnight. He felt no need to prove them wrong. He simply refused to accept their prediction as fate. The world around him crackled with cold as he reached the scattered branches, and the wind roared harder as if challenging him directly. He inhaled the sharp air, squared his shoulders, and began planning his shelter in silence. Midnight was approaching, but he would not meet it unprepared. Elias moved toward the scattered crystal tree branches with a steady pace, feeling the wind grow harsher as dusk thickened across the frozen plain. The light dimmed faster now, as if the planet wanted to force him into the darkness before he was ready. He crouched beside the largest branch, which was almost as tall as he was, its surface cracked into shining plates of translucent ice. He pressed his hand against it, testing its firmness. The branch was brittle, but it would hold long enough if he placed it correctly. He gripped one end and pulled, hearing the ice creak and fracture as it shifted. The effort sent a shock through his arms. The cold made even small tasks feel like lifting stone. He dragged the branch several meters toward a shallow dip in the landscape where the snow had collected in thicker layers. The dip was created by years of wind carving into the frozen ground, leaving a natural depression that could provide some protection. He stepped into the dip and examined how the gusts curled around its edges, watching the flow of loose snow spiraling upward on one side. The wind was powerful, but it was predictable. As long as he positioned each branch at an angle that redirected the gusts instead of resisting them directly, the structure would hold through the night. He began planting the first crystal tree branch into the snow, driving its pointed end deep until it stood upright. He packed snow around its base with his hands, shaping it into a mound that tightened around the bottom of the branch. He repeated the motion until his fingers felt stiff and numb, but he continued working without hesitation. The sun dropped completely behind the distant cliffs, leaving only a pale glow that lingered briefly along the edge of the world. In that fading light, he saw a sheet of icy fog rolling in across the plain. Once the fog arrived, visibility would drop to almost nothing. He moved faster. He collected smaller branches and broken splinters scattered across the ground and brought them back to the dip in multiple trips. Each time he walked back to gather more materials, the wind sliced at his face, leaving thin streaks of frost along the edges of his cheeks. He narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly so he would not lose too much heat through rapid breaths. He kept his movements controlled, never rushing so hard that he risked slipping or wasting strength. Elias arranged the branches in a rough semicircle, adjusting their angles each time the wind shifted. He noticed something important as he built. The wind always entered the dip from one direction with more strength than the others. It struck from the flat open plain, flowed down the slope into the depression, and then curled upward again on the opposite side. If he blocked that entry point well enough, the gusts inside the dip would weaken significantly. He focused on reinforcing that side of his makeshift barrier first. He planted the largest branch at the center of the entry point, tilting it slightly backward so the wind would hit its face and slide upward rather than ripping it from the ground. He used broken shards to wedge the base into a narrow crack in the frozen surface, giving it a stronger anchor. He then stacked two smaller branches on each side of it, creating a layered structure that resembled the beginnings of a primitive wall. Snow collected in the gaps immediately, helping fill the spaces between the branches. He paused only when a sudden, violent gust struck the structure, rattling the branches loudly. He watched intently, ready to adjust if something failed. But the branches held, bending slightly backward under the pressure but not collapsing. He exhaled and continued working, encouraged by the result. The windbreak was not finished, but it was functional. As the fog reached him, he felt the temperature plunge even further. The fog clung to his clothing and froze into thin sheets of ice almost immediately. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling his heartbeat hammer against the growing cold, but he did not allow fear to set in. He understood that emotion could not help him now. He needed rhythm, focus, and relentless movement. He gathered more branches, stumbling slightly as the fog thickened to the point where he could barely see beyond a few steps. He relied on his footprints in the snow to guide him back to the dip each time. The cold numbed his legs, and his jacket stiffened around his torso as frost accumulated along the seams. His breaths grew harsher, turning into small clouds that instantly crystallized on his skin. Once he had collected every usable piece of debris in the immediate area, he knelt beside his wall and began reinforcing it with snow. He pushed handfuls of packed snow into the gaps between branches, using it as mortar. The wind helped him by forcing the snow deeper into the spaces, but it also threatened to rip his work apart every time a strong gust hit. He pressed harder, shaping the snow into thick wedges that held the branches together. He formed a partial enclosure that resembled a crude half-shell. The dip in the ground became the base of his shelter, while the branches served as the spine. The snow acted as both anchor and insulation. As he worked, he remained aware of the world beyond the fog. He could faintly hear the distant vibrations of shifting ice far across the plain, a reminder that the frozen landscape was as alive as any jungle, though it expressed its movement through sound and temperature rather than motion. A particularly strong gust tore through the dip at one point, scattering snow across his face and forcing him to turn away. The wind roared like a physical force, howling through the gaps in the barrier. Elias pivoted quickly and inspected the wall again. One of the smaller branches had loosened and leaned outward. He repositioned it without hesitation, packing more snow against its base until it held firm. He could not afford any weaknesses. Once the main windbreak resisted the direct flow of air, he began constructing a second layer behind it. This second line of branches was shorter and placed closer to the center of the dip, angled inward. The purpose of the second layer was not to block wind entirely, but to disrupt whatever airflow still managed to pass through the first barrier. The more the wind twisted, collided, and slowed, the less heat he would lose from his body when he rested. The fog thickened until the world felt entirely closed around him, shrinking into nothing more than the space inside his shelter. His fingers were numb, his face burned from the cold, and frost clung to his eyelashes, making every blink a small effort. But he pressed on, driven by the understanding that his only chance of surviving the night depended on what he did now. The darkness would not pause for him. He pressed his back against the inner layer of branches for a moment, feeling how little protection it offered in its current state. He forced himself to his feet and added more snow, more broken shards, more reinforcement. He repeated the motions until the muscles in his arms trembled from exertion. He wrapped his jacket tighter around himself, exhaled clouds of ice, and pushed through the exhaustion. The windbreak grew stronger with each adjustment, each handful of snow, each repositioned branch. The structure slowly transformed from scattered debris into a barrier capable of resisting the planet's deadly winds. Elias ignored the growing stiffness in his limbs and the ache in his hands. He worked until the fog around him seemed to glow faintly with the cold, as if the darkness carried its own frozen light. When he finally stepped back and studied what he had built, he knew it was not perfect. But it was enough to turn the lethal wind into something he could endure. The night had only begun, and the cold was tightening its grip on the land. He understood that he had more to do. He needed heat, light, and a way to protect his body while he slept. But for the first time since arriving on Velnor 6, he had created something that stood against the world, rather than yielding to it. The wind roared again, but this time it struck the barrier with a dull thud instead of a tearing howl. Snow drifted downward, settling on top of the branches. Elias allowed himself one slow breath of relief. He had carved out a space the planet could not immediately reclaim. The rest of the night, however, would demand even more from him. Elias stood inside the half-formed enclosure, listening to the wind break against the outer wall with deep, muffled thuds. The gusts no longer hit him with full force, but the cold that slipped through the gap still gnawed at his skin, creeping beneath his jacket and settling against his bones. He flexed his hands again, trying to coax warmth back into his fingers. His shelter was a start, but it was not enough. He needed heat, light, and a source of energy that would keep his body from surrendering to the creeping numbness that threatened to settle permanently into his muscles. He looked around the dip in the ground, forcing his eyes to focus through the frost clinging to his eyelashes. The fog had thickened into a gray shroud, swirling in slow motion and blurring the edges of everything. He could still make out the shapes of the scattered branches and icy debris nearby, but he needed something more than wood. Crystal tree branches burned poorly. They crackled, sputtered, and died within minutes. He needed fuel that burned hot and long. He remembered the resin he had seen earlier, glistening inside splintered trunks like frozen amber. That resin was flammable. The problem was reaching it in the dark, while the fog and wind cut visibility down to a few steps. But he had no choice. He pulled his jacket tighter, lowered his head into the wind, and stepped outside the shelter. The air was merciless. The cold slapped him across the face instantly, forcing him to gasp. Each breath felt sharp enough to carve his chest from the inside. He braced himself and moved slowly forward, tracing the faint outline of his earlier footprints. The fog swallowed him with every step, covering the world in a thick, shifting curtain. He kept one hand stretched outward, using the wind direction to orient himself. The gusts were still strongest in the same direction, pushing against his side and guiding him along the same path he had walked dozens of times while collecting branches. He trusted that pattern now. The first crystal tree stump appeared as a dim shape ahead of him, rising from the snow like a frozen monument. He approached it carefully, kneeling beside it and brushing away the frost that clung to its surface. The stump was cracked from old storms, its interior exposed in jagged layers. Elias slipped his fingers into one of the cracks and scraped at the hardened resin, prying free a brittle chunk. It snapped off easily, falling into his palm like a shard of frozen honey. He continued digging out more pieces, scraping them together until he had several handfuls. His hands throbbed from the cold, but he ignored the pain, focusing on the task. He moved from stump to stump, collecting resin until he had enough to fill both pockets of his jacket. The resin pieces dug into his sides, but he welcomed the discomfort. It meant he could still feel his body. Once he had gathered as much as he could carry, he turned back toward the direction of the shelter, letting the wind guide him again. His footprints had already faded beneath drifting snow, but the dip in the terrain was familiar enough that he found it without too much struggle. He stepped inside the shelter and let out a slow breath. The windbreak held firm. He knelt on the ground and emptied his pockets, watching the resin pieces scatter across the packed snow like pale, glassy stones. He picked up 2 stones he had gathered earlier, flat, sharply edged rocks worn smooth by the wind. He gripped one in each hand and struck them together. The sound cracked through the enclosure like a spark itself. He struck again, then again. On the 4th strike, a tiny spark appeared and died instantly. On the 6th, another spark flashed brighter, catching the edge of one resin piece. He leaned closer and struck again, this time directing the spark deliberately toward the resin. The brittle shard caught, glowing faintly with a thin orange ember that flickered like a dying star. Elias cupped his hands around it, blocking the wind's weak remnants, and breathed slowly onto the tiny glow. It brightened, eating its way through the resin with cautious hunger. He fed the ember another piece. The flame grew larger, small but alive, casting a soft, warm glow on his frost-covered fingers. Elias felt a surge of relief, almost overwhelming. He had fire. He had something that belonged to him alone, something the cold could not immediately devour. He gathered the smallest crystal tree twigs and added them one by one to the flame. Each twig hissed at first, then caught fire, sending thin tendrils of smoke curling upward. The smell was sharp and resinous, different from wood smoke, but warm and comforting in a way nothing else on this planet had been so far. He leaned closer, feeling heat radiate toward his face. The flame grew steadily. He took a long branch and split its brittle end, packing a thick clump of resin into the split so it would act like a torch. Once he held it near the growing fire, the resin ignited, climbing up the inside of the branch until the entire top half blazed with bright, steady flames. Elias watched the torch flare and stabilize before planting it firmly into the snow at the center of the shelter. The sudden light illuminated the interior of the dip, casting long shadows across the snow walls and branches. The warmth spread slowly, enough to thaw the frost on his jacket and bring sensation back into his fingers. He repeated the same process with 2 more branches, packing them with resin, lighting them, and planting them at different points around the shelter's edge. Soon the enclosure glowed with 3 steady torches, their flames bending slightly from the weakened wind but refusing to extinguish. He studied the movement of the heat carefully. The torches warmed the air, creating upward drafts that pulled the cold downward and away from his body. The snow walls reflected some of the heat back toward him, forming a small pocket of livable space inside the dip. He pressed his hands close to the nearest flame and felt a pulse of gratitude for the simple fact that he could still feel warmth. Once the torches stabilized, he moved outside the wall briefly to gather more broken branches. The fog was even thicker now, and the darkness above had settled into a near-black blanket, swallowing the sky. But the light from the torches behind him guided his steps. He collected every piece of debris he could reach and brought them inside the shelter, stacking them neatly so he could feed the fire through the night if he needed to. He planted 2 more torches near the entrance of the dip, creating a narrow corridor of light that cut through the fog like a walkway. The heat from the combined torches pushed the cold air further from the center of the enclosure, creating a crude thermal zone where he could sit and breathe without feeling the immediate sting of freezing air. He tested the ground near the center of the dip, pressing his hand against it. The snow was still cold, but it was no longer freezing hard enough to numb his skin instantly. He gathered shredded bark from inside the brittle branches and used it to form a padded layer over the snow. The layer was thin, but it created a barrier between his body and the frozen ground. He lowered himself onto the bark slowly, resting his back against the snow wall. The torches flickered in a quiet rhythm, each flame dancing to its own pattern, yet forming a unified glow that pushed back against the hostile darkness outside. The wind still roared past the outer barrier, but inside his small circle of light, the world felt less like a frozen wasteland and more like a place where life could endure. He watched the torches for several minutes, letting the warmth seep into his muscles. His exhaustion pressed down on him heavily. His body trembled not from fear, but from the shock of pushing itself so hard in the cold. He pulled his jacket tightly around himself and stretched his legs toward the torchlight, allowing the heat to ease the stiffness. The night on Velnor 6 had fully arrived, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. Elias had fire, a barrier, and a place to rest. The cold still surrounded him, but it could not reach him easily now. He allowed himself a slow breath, then another. The torches hissed softly, filling the shelter with a steady, warm glow. He would last the night. The planet had taken its first strike at him, and he had answered with flame. The torches burned with steady determination, their flames reaching upward as if challenging the frozen air above the shelter. Elias watched them flicker in a rhythmic glow that made the walls of packed snow shimmer with reflected light. The warmth inside the dip grew slowly, gathering in layers that settled gently around him. His muscles relaxed bit by bit, grateful for even the smallest reprieve from the brutal cold outside. But warmth alone was not enough. He understood that the torches could not burn forever, and the planet still had many hours of night to unleash its deepest cold. If he wanted to wake up alive, he needed to turn this fragile shelter into something stronger, something capable of holding warmth even when the torches weakened. He stood up carefully, feeling the stiffness in his legs as blood returned to his limbs. The air inside the dip had warmed, but stepping just a few meters closer to the entrance reminded him how thin that safety was. The wind still sliced through the narrow opening of his windbreak, slipping around the edges of the branches to bite at his exposed skin. He tightened his jaw and moved toward the outer barrier to inspect the structure again. Each torch cast long shadows across the snow walls, giving the shelter a sense of depth that had not existed earlier. Elias pressed his hand against one of the branches. It trembled slightly under the force of the wind, bending forward and then snapping back into place. The structure held for now, but it needed reinforcement. He knelt beside the base of the windbreak and scooped handfuls of snow, packing them firmly around the bottom of the branches. The snow was softer inside the dip than outside, warmed slightly by the torches, and he had to bring it from the colder outer edge to ensure it solidified properly. As he worked, the wind groaned against the barrier like some breathing creature trapped on the other side, angry at being denied entry. He moved to the next branch, repeating the process. His fingers burned from the cold, frost forming along the creases of his gloves, but each movement tightened the barrier. Snow wedged between the branches, hardened almost instantly, forming a natural cement that bound the pieces together. He pressed more snow into the cracks, shaping it with the heel of his palm, making each section blend into one solid mass. The movement soon became rhythmic, the repetition soothing in a way he did not expect. He looked over his shoulder toward the torches, their glow providing just enough light to guide his work. The shelter felt more alive now, as if each flame breathed heat into the frozen landscape. He returned to his task with renewed focus, reinforcing the entire curvature of the windbreak until the wall resembled a thick, uneven arc of snow and crystal branches, sturdy enough to withstand the shifting winds. When the outer wall felt reliable beneath his hands, he stepped back and studied the inner structure. The second layer remained intact, but the cold air still slipped between the branches. He knelt again and pushed snow into those cracks as well. The inner wall needed to hold the warm air in place and prevent it from escaping into the wind. As he worked, he could feel the warmth behind him spreading outward. The air near the torches had become almost comfortable, and the contrast between that heat and the cold air at the edge of the shelter created a swirling sensation that moved across his back. The warmth felt almost like a gentle hand pressing against him, encouraging him to continue. He finished tightening the inner wall and stood up again, breathing slowly to steady his pulse. The exertion had forced him to sweat slightly beneath his jacket, and he knew sweat was dangerous in extreme cold. He stepped back toward the torches to let the heat dry the moisture before it could freeze against his skin. He held his hands toward the nearest flame, feeling the tingling warmth flow back through his fingers. Once his body recovered some strength, he turned his attention to the roof. He had no materials to create a full covering, and attempting to build one could collapse the walls. But he did not need a roof. He only needed a way to trap more warmth. He scanned the dip, searching for anything he could use. His eyes focused on the snow that had begun piling along the top of the windbreak, blown there by the wind. It formed a natural rim that thickened gradually as the wind continued its work. He realized the planet was helping him without meaning to. The wind was shaping the snow in a way that insulated the top of the shelter. He climbed carefully onto the inner slope of the dip and reached upward, pulling more snow onto the top of the wall. He pressed it down gently, shaping it into a smoother, thicker layer. The windpack formed a kind of shallow arch that trapped warm air more effectively while still letting the smoke from the torches escape upward. Once satisfied with the top of the windbreak, he turned his attention to the central area of the shelter. The shredded bark he had laid out earlier had created a barrier between his body and the frozen ground, but he needed more insulation. He gathered additional bark fragments from the broken branches he had brought inside and layered them across the ground, forming a thicker pad that extended several feet in each direction. He pressed the layers down firmly, making sure they did not shift when he stepped on them. He then dug shallow depressions for the torches, pressing their bases firmly into the snow so they stood at stable angles. He positioned them in a triangular pattern around the insulated ground layer, creating an even distribution of heat. The flames filled the shelter with a warm amber glow that reflected in the ice walls like fire trapped inside crystal. Elias lowered himself onto the padded ground again, stretching his legs toward the nearest torch. The ground beneath him felt warmer now, the bark acting as a barrier against the frozen surface. The torches warmed the air around him, creating a stable pocket of heated space that resisted the cold pushing in from outside. The fog outside the shelter swirled slowly, catching hints of light from the torches and giving the world beyond the barrier a dim, eerie shimmer. Elias listened carefully for any change in the wind. The gusts still came in waves, but the tone had shifted. Instead of a sharp howl, the wind now struck the barrier with a softer, muted sound. The walls held firm, the snowpack absorbing the impact. He leaned back against the inner wall, feeling warmth on his face and chest. The air inside the shelter was still cold, but it was no longer deadly. It felt like the cold air inside a winter cabin, harsh but survivable. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to rest his mind. His heartbeat slowed, settling into a calmer rhythm. He opened his eyes again to check the torches. Each flame still burned with a steady, bright glow. The resin inside the branches fed the fire with surprising consistency. He watched the firelight dance against the walls and thought about the alien cadets who had retreated into their caves. He wondered how well their biological membranes coped with the steep drop in temperature after sunset. He did not envy them, nor did he feel superiority. His survival depended not on advantage, but on effort, and he understood that every small action he took mattered. He pulled his jacket tightly around his body and shifted onto his side. The warmth settled around him as he adjusted his position. The padded bark beneath him softened the pressure against his ribs. The torches crackled softly, releasing faint wisps of smoke that drifted upward and vanished into the open sky above. A deep sense of quiet settled into the shelter. Outside, the wind continued its endless assault on the planet's surface. But inside, the flames glowed like guardians holding back the night. Elias closed his eyes for a longer moment, listening to the soft pulse of warmth that surrounded him. He allowed himself to breathe slowly and deeply, knowing he had built something that would endure until dawn. He had created a circle of warmth in a world designed to freeze him. Now all he needed to do was rest and let the shelter do its work. The torches burned with slow, deliberate resolve, their flames shrinking little by little as the night deepened. Elias remained curled on the insulated bed of bark, wrapped in the faint cocoon of warmth created by the barrier and the dying fire. His eyelids fluttered open every so often as instinct warned him to watch the flames, to ensure none had gone out completely. Fatigue settled heavy across his limbs, pressing down like a thick blanket he longed to surrender to, but the cold reminded him that sleep could never claim him fully. He drifted between brief moments of rest and sharpened focus, guarding the fire with quiet vigilance. Outside the shelter, the wind shifted gradually. The howling gusts softened, adopting a lower, tired moan, as if the storm itself had become exhausted from hours of assault. Elias raised his head slightly when the wind's pitch changed, listening with narrowed attention. The drops in temperature that accompanied each new gust had eased. The cold remained severe, but it no longer pressed into the dip with the same ferocity. The torches, though diminished, continued to radiate consistent warmth around the insulated ground. He turned onto his back, staring up at the narrow slice of sky visible above the rim of the windbreak. The stars had disappeared behind thick clouds of frost, turning the heavens into a swirling gray veil. But small patches of lighter color had begun to form near the horizon, the first hints of dawn. Elias watched the faint brightness spread across the edge of the world like a thin ribbon of silver. At first it was hard to tell whether the change was real or a trick of the frost, but then the light grew softer, clearer, pushing aside the last remnants of the deepest night. He forced himself into a sitting position, groaning softly as stiff muscles objected. His body felt heavy, like an object carved from ice and only recently thawed. But warmth still clung to his jacket and legs. The shelter had worked. His body remained functional. His mind stayed sharp enough to assess the surrounding conditions. He placed his hands against the insulated ground and pushed himself to his feet. His legs trembled slightly, but he steadied himself with a slow breath. He checked the torches first. The resin had burned down to glowing embers at the top of each branch. The flames flickered weakly, as if bowing in exhaustion after fighting the frost for an entire night. He knelt beside one torch, gathering a few leftover resin pieces from the ground. He placed them at the base of one ember. The resin hissed and sparked, but did not fully ignite. The night, it seemed, had drained most of the fire's strength. He did not force it. He would not need fire much longer. The windbreak had frozen into a solid barrier of snow and crystal, sealed together by the night's cold. Even the smallest gaps had been filled by drifting frost, reinforcing the structure into something stronger than anything he could have built alone. Elias pressed his palm against the wall. The snowpack felt firm, unmoving, a silent testament to the work he had done hours earlier. He took a moment to appreciate it. On any other world, a man building a shelter from branches and snow would have been unremarkable. But on Velnor 6, where biological species relied on natural membranes and humans were expected to fail, the accomplishment felt like reclaiming a truth others had forgotten. Survival belonged not just to biology, but to knowledge, instinct, and will. He walked toward the entrance of the dip, standing just inside the barrier as the first strands of pale morning light filtered through the fog. The sky above brightened gradually, revealing new hues in the frozen landscape. The snowfields caught the faint light and reflected it in shimmering waves, transforming the flat plain into a field of silver mirrors. The air remained brutally cold, but the planet's lethal edge had been dulled. Elias stepped outside the barrier, letting the morning air wash across his face. The cold hit him immediately, a sharp reminder that he was still on a hostile world, but he no longer felt threatened by it. He had endured the worst of the night. Everything from now on was manageable. He looked across the plain toward the distant ice cliffs, expecting to see signs of movement. At first, nothing shifted. The fog obscured most of the shapes, and he wondered if the other cadets had made it through the night. Then he saw faint figures emerging one by one from the cracks in the cliffs. The alien cadets stumbled into the open, clutching their membranes tightly around their bodies. Some leaned heavily against the icy walls, shivering as they tried to regain strength. Their membranes dripped condensation from the extreme temperature fluctuations. Elias watched them gaze around in disoriented confusion, each stunned that the night had been far more severe than the Academy had claimed. A heavy mechanical hum vibrated through the air as the Academy shuttle descended from the clouds. Its engines displaced the fog beneath it, creating swirling currents that spread across the plain like ripples in water. The shuttle landed with a controlled thud a short distance away, its landing gears sinking slightly into the packed snow. The door slid open, and the crystalline instructor stepped out, her angular body gleaming with reflections of the morning light. She walked across the plain with slow, deliberate steps, scanning the environment with a mixture of caution and expectation. Her eyes landed first on the alien cadets emerging from the cliffs. She approached one cadet who clung to the rock wall for stability. Her voice carried a note of measured surprise as she assessed his condition. She checked another cadet next, sliding her crystalline hand along the side of his membrane to ensure he was not frostbitten beneath it. Then she turned away from the cliffs and looked across the open plain. Her gaze traveled slowly across the landscape until it settled on the dip where Elias stood. Her posture stiffened at the sight of him, upright, alert, and stepping confidently out of a shelter that glowed faintly with the dim embers of spent torches. She approached him, her movements sharper now, as if she had suddenly become aware of something unexpected. Elias stepped aside so she could see the inside of the shelter clearly. The torches, though dying, still cast faint spirals of smoke upward. The windbreak stood solid and compact, shaped not by instinct but by careful calculation. The insulated ground showed a clear outline of where he had slept. The instructor studied the structure silently, her eyes, small crystalline pupils, reflecting the flicker of the embers. She reached out and placed her hand against the windbreak. A soft crackle sounded beneath her touch as frost fractured along the snowpack. She traced the seams between the branches, examining how he had shaped the snow to bind everything together. Then she stepped back and stared at him with an expression that blurred the line between admiration and disbelief. "You slept here," she said at last, her voice steady but tinged with a faint tremor. "Yes," he answered simply. His voice felt rough from the cold, but steady. She looked at the dying torches once more. Then she turned to face the distant ice cliffs, where the alien cadets still struggled to emerge fully from their shelters. Her crystalline surface reflected the morning light as she walked slowly back toward the shuttle. She paused halfway, lifting her communicator to record something. Elias could not hear her words clearly, but he recognized the rhythm of formal documentation. She was rewriting the Academy's handbook. When she returned to the alien cadets, she helped one stand upright, her movements more careful now, as if she had realized how close to failure the biological membranes had come during the night. She led the group toward the shuttle's entrance. Elias followed behind them at a measured pace. The cold clung to his jacket, but warmth still radiated faintly from his chest. He climbed the shuttle ramp and took a seat near the middle of the cabin. As the shuttle lifted off the ground, Elias looked out the window at the shelter that still stood proudly against the snowy plain. The windbreak remained firm, the torches now extinguished but still standing like quiet markers of effort and resilience. The fog swirled around the dip like a final acknowledgement from the world itself. When the shuttle rose higher, the dawn spread fully across the horizon, turning the snowfields into a brilliant sea of light. For the first time since arriving, the planet looked gentle rather than hostile. But Elias knew better. The gentleness was merely the world's other face. Survival here was earned, not granted. The instructor walked down the aisle and stopped beside him. Her crystalline voice carried clearly as she spoke, addressing him alone. "Your methods will be added to the Academy's survival protocols," she said. "Your performance will be studied. You have altered the standards for this trial." He nodded once, accepting the words not as praise but as a statement of fact. When the shuttle left the atmosphere and the frozen surface of Velnor 6 shrank beneath it, Elias leaned back in his seat and exhaled slowly. His body throbbed from cold and effort, but he felt a steady warmth settle inside him, separate from the torches and the barrier he had built. It was the warmth of knowing he had faced a world designed to kill him, and he had walked away stronger. The cold had not claimed him. The night had not broken him. The warnings had not defined him. He had built windbreakers, lit torches, slept warm, and survived where no one expected he could. And the Academy would never look